Today we'd like to welcome James Hyatt and Bonnie Fraser to the stage. They're cousins, and they're here to tell us about Fred Lodge and his experiences in the war. Fred was a detailed diarist, and they have been fortunate enough to read about his experiences. I'm not sure if they've heard them firsthand as well. Were you able to hear them firsthand and read about them in his diaries? So let's give them a big welcome to the stage.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. I guess my mic is on. I can hear myself talking to you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for allowing us to share this story with you today. As I look out in this audience, I see many people I've known since I grew up here in Kenora, as did Bonnie. We have relatives in the audience, and we're going to share a story with you today about Bonnie's father, Fred, who also grew up here in Kenora. He was the youngest child of a family with 9 children. His parents emigrated out of the East End of London and ended up in Monackey about 1907 with 6 children, and then they had a further 3 children here in Canada. Fred, as I say, was the youngest. His mother died young, and so he then was very close to his older sisters for obvious reasons. And what we're going to tell you about him is the experiences he had mostly during World War II and subsequently, what those experiences did to him and how he turned out. And I'm just going to interject a remark here that I don't have in my formal script. A question I asked myself when I finished reading his diaries: could I have acted with the same grace and courage and fortitude that he did? And I suspect everybody who's had exciting experiences in their lives ask those kind of questions. Okay, in World War I, both Fred's father and his oldest brother Bill enlisted in the Canadian Army, and they served overseas. His older brother Bill was killed as a result of a gas shell in 1917 and is buried in Belgium. And when World War II broke out, Fred, like a lot of young men in this community, rushed to join up, and he joined the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders in Winnipeg, and then trained in Shiloh and Winnipeg before they moved on to Valcartier. His sister Nellie asked him to keep a diary of his experiences, which he did, and he was quite a committed diarist, and so basically every day of his wartime service, including, as you'll hear later, the time he spent in the German prisoner of war camp, he recorded all of his experiences in some detail. Now, I'll just move this here. And these are the diaries. They're in various kinds of books. They're more than 75 years old now, and they're still in remarkable shape, and his handwriting was very, very good, although it's very small, and so it was quite a job. We've transcribed every one of these diaries now, and I think Bonnie and her siblings have plans for where they're going to end up for their preservation. Now, after training in Shiloh and in Valcartier, they moved on to Halifax in early December of 1940, and they sailed on a ship called the SS Pasteur, which arrived in England on Christmas Eve 1940, and they were stationed in Aldershot, south of London. For 18 months, they were used for coastal defense because at the time the Allies were very worried about a German invasion or landing on the south shore of England. In some ways, it was like a vacation for Fred because during the week they would have exercises and they'd do training and things like that. And then on the weekends, he'd often get a pass and go up to London and see his aunts and uncles and cousins who lived there. And they'd take in all sorts of movies, and it was, other than the times when they were in London when the bombing was going on, it was kind of an idyllic experience, which he records in his diary. And one interesting story is he was out in the street one day, and I don't know if you've heard of Rudolf Hess. He was a deputy leader in Germany, and in that time he decided he wanted to try a peace initiative, so he flew an airplane to England, and of course the British promptly put him in prison, but his airplane was on this trailer being dragged down the street, and it stopped, so Fred took the opportunity to take a piece of fabric off it. He sent it to a girl he knew in Winnipeg, not the one he eventually married, and she told the Winnipeg Free Press about this thing, and he records how happy he was that she didn't give the Free Press his name, because it would have, you can imagine why. Now, where do I put, there we are. So his training included first aid, small arms, radio procedures, and riding a motorcycle. He's on a motorcycle, and I don't know if that shows it very closely, but he also studied radio repair and mathematics. And he was in London when German bombs were falling, and several times he reports in his diaries helping the fire wardens to rescue people from collapsed or partially collapsed buildings. So it was quite an eventful experience and time. Now, they also went on route marches, and they're supposed to improve your physical fitness and build unit cohesion, but they can be pretty boring. I have personal experience with doing those sort of things. In the spring of 1942, the Cameron Highlanders, along with other battalions, units of the 2nd Canadian Division, were warned for a raid on Dieppe in France, and they trained for it, but the operation was supposed to happen in May, June, but it was canceled. About a month later, it was rescheduled for August, and the troops were assembled on the south coast of England for an assault on Dieppe on the 19th of August. And you've probably all heard about that in school or in reading that you've done. They were, okay. And there you can see the sort of the geography of it. They were, as I say, in ports along the south coast. Now, most of his battalion crossed the channel on a troop ship, and then they were transferred to smaller R boats about a kilometer off the coast. And this slide, you can see on the left-hand side on the troop ship, and that is actually a picture of his unit getting off their ship. And on the right is the smaller R boats being shepherded by a motor torpedo boat. And Fred himself crossed the entire channel on an R boat as part of the first landing element. So this carried about 30 or 35 people in that little boat, and it sort of tossed and turned. I suspect it was quite an experience to cross the channel in the night, expecting to be shot at in the morning. Okay. Now, again, there's the other R boat picture, and I think I've got, no, there we are. Now, this is where I think you could read the slide, where the units were supposed to land, and the Cameron Highlanders were on the right-hand side, along with the South Saskatchewan Regiment, and they were supposed to have the South Saskatchewan Regiment further west along the coast from them, but as it turned out, they were landed in the wrong place. So when the troops landed, the South Saskatchewan Regiment soldiers had to pass through all the Cameron Highlanders, and as you can imagine, it was very confusing because the units got all mixed up and people were trying to figure out where they were supposed to be and who they were supposed to be with. Okay, the only fortunate thing for Fred and his buddies was that the beach at Pourville is relatively flat, and they could get off their boats and on ashore without having to climb a steep seawall or a cliff, unlike in Dieppe, where there are very steep cliffs and a sort of a high seawall, and many Canadian troops lost their lives as a result of the difference there. Now, he was among the first on the Pourville beach because he was a signaler in the headquarters company. So he carried a radio around, and he followed the commanding officer of his battalion with that radio. And as they arrived at the beach, the company sergeant major stood up and promptly got shot. And then the battalion commander stood up to tell the medic to help the company sergeant major, and he got shot. And so you can imagine that kind of an environment it's very noisy in a military battle like that. There are lots of things happening. It's a very emotional time for everybody involved, and you're all trying to do your job, but at the same time, you're very aware of all of the threats and the things that are coming at you. Okay. Now, the Cameron Highlanders fought their way inland along the River Sea, and I don't know if that's clear enough on this slide, but right in front, behind Pourville, there's this long sort of steep-sided valley, and they managed to get up to the top of it while the Germans were continuously shooting at them with artillery, mortars, machine guns, and obviously rifles and small arms. And they managed to go further inland than any other Canadian unit that day, but it was at a terrible cost, and Fred lived and saw it all. After about 5 hours, the troops were ordered to withdraw to the boats, and by that time, by the time that Fred got back to the beach, there was only one boat left, and it was full. He grabbed onto the side of it and hoped he could be towed out to the troop ship off the coast. It'd be about a kilometer out off the coast. Unfortunately for him, his clothing was all wet. He had a radio strapped on his back, and he still had his rifle with him. So he got about 10 or 15 meters, yards off the beach, and the weight was too much, and it just dragged him away. He couldn't hold on to the boat, and he sank promptly to the bottom. And I have this from a cousin of ours who he related this story to. He managed to shed his radio and his rifle and almost walk up the bottom until he got out of the water. And then he was being shot at again, so he sort of crawled up behind the seawall. He was soaking wet. He was obviously very, very tired and in shock. And after a little while, despite all the noise and all of the threats to him, he sort of, I don't know whether he was in shock or he went unconscious or he fell asleep, but he was unaware of what was going on until a German soldier came along and kicked him in the side to see whether he was alive or dead. And of course he was alive, and told him to get up and moved him off. And after the raid, the Germans, one of the Germans told them that they'd been expected. Now, maybe the German was just sort of lording it over him. I don't know the answer to that, but they always felt, and Fred always felt, that someone had let the secret out before they got there, and that was one of the reasons that it was such a difficult operation for everyone. All right, this is the cemetery at Dieppe, and where the graves of most of the 916 Canadians who died that day are buried. And these are the grave markers of his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Gostling, and his friend Sergeant Bill Rankine. And earlier I showed you a slide where he was sitting on a motorcycle, and Bill Rankine is right there. And my wife and I actually have walked through the cemetery, and after reading Fred's diaries, and we remembered the names of the people mentioned, and you walk up and down these rows, and I can tell you it's a very emotional experience to see those many names of the young Canadians who perished that day. Okay. 1,950 Canadians were captured that day, Fred among them, and you can see some of them in this photo. An interesting thing I've also found out was that after the fighting was all over, and those who were alive and able to walk around were sort of sitting in places like that, then the Germans and the Canadian soldiers were sharing cigarettes, and the Canadians, many of them were all wet, but the Germans were lighting their cigarettes for them, and they'd gone through a common experience together, I guess is the best way to put it. Okay. The Canadian prisoners were gathered up, they were disarmed, provided essential first aid. The seriously wounded were operated on without anesthetics. Now, you have to remember that there were many, many casualties, both Canadian and German, and so they ran out of anesthetics very quickly, and I suspect you would understand why the Germans used the anesthetics on their own troops first, but it was a hard deal for the Canadian wounded to go through. The severely wounded were shot. If the German medical officers figured that the person could not survive, an officer went along and essentially euthanized them. Fred saw all of that. Once they were assembled, they were marched 17 kilometers to an old factory, and there was nothing there really, but the Germans provided them with some food, some water, and they stayed there for 2 days while the Germans organized transport to their eventual prison camp. 60 men were loaded onto each 40-man boxcar. In Europe, they moved troops around for a long time on these railway cars, and they were called 40-man boxcars because they were supposed to fit 40. Well, 60 Canadian prisoners were loaded in each one of these cars, really shoved in. They were provided with several loaves of bread, with a couple of containers of water, and a honey bucket. And it was expected to last them for 7 days. And when they arrived in Lambsdorff, Germany, which was the first location where they were put in a prison camp, their condition was described as horrific by a British medical officer who himself was a prisoner of war and was at the prison camp. They had suffered a shocking experience. They didn't have enough food, and the conditions in the boxcars were very, very difficult, and I won't go into any more detail on that. Okay, these pictures show the tourist version of the Lambsdorff POW camp. It all looks pretty neat and clean and well set up. When Fred arrived, there were approximately 30,000 British, French, Russian, and Polish prisoners of war already there. Typhoid, cholera, and tuberculosis infections were rampant. Food was basic and in short supply. Clean water was difficult to find. Over the next 18 months, Fred would see the best and worst of human behavior, not only from the German guards, but also from other POWs, with thefts, beatings, and murders occurring. And something I hadn't understood until we started studying this was that the Germans controlled the perimeter of the camp, and they provided food and essential things to the prisoners inside, and the prisoners organized life inside, with the exception that the Germans would come in from time to time looking for radio parts or weapons or diaries, things that were contraband. Okay, Fred was not reported as a prisoner of war for 4 months after he was captured, so he got no mail or parcels, and his family knew nothing of his fate. He, in his diary, records how hard it was that he didn't get letters. Everyone else was getting letters, and he wasn't getting any. And you can imagine how hard that would be for your morale. He volunteered to be the cook in his hut, and each hut had someone who looked after the food for everyone who lived there. And because of that, he was permitted to have a vegetable garden out back. And he grew lettuce, tomatoes, carrots, potatoes, all the things you can imagine. And it was mostly with seeds that were eventually sent to him by his family from right here in Kenora. When the Germans were searching for weapons or diaries or radio parts or any of the other contraband things, he would go out into his garden and bury his diaries. And he told my mother a story about sitting in his garden in a rainstorm, burying his diaries, and he couldn't get them for 6 weeks because they were watching him. Okay. I'm just going to make sure I don't lose my place here. And he was frequently ill from dysentery, malnutrition. In January 1944, most of the Canadian prisoners of war were transferred to a prisoner of war camp named Stargard near Stettin along the Baltic coast. They remained there until the end of January 1945. The Canadian prisoners were often used as labor on farms, in logging camps, and in mines. Fred was a little older than most of the other Canadian prisoners, and he was not a troublemaker, and he had learned to speak some German, so the Germans named him a trusted man, and that meant that they trusted him to not do anything too wild, and it also meant that the other Canadian prisoners trusted him to look out for their interests. And he was allowed to travel in the local area unescorted by a prisoner, or by a guard, or someone who was going to keep watch on him. He would collect Red Cross parcels from in the city and deliver those parcels and mail to the Canadian prisoners who were spread around the area working. Okay, this is, if you look on this slide, there's a red dot, that's where Lambsdorff is, and then to the north of it, there's an arrow, and that's where Stargard is, up closer to the Baltic coast. And they're both in the area of Germany, which was transferred to Poland at the end of World War II. So just to give you a sense of where the geography is. Okay. This slide is the Lambsdorff prisoner war camp. Fred drew this diagram, and incidentally, this is one of those things that the prisoners were not supposed to do, which was to make a diagram of their camp. I guess the guards felt it was providing intelligence that the prisoners did not need to have and shouldn't have. Okay. These are, this is a picture taken of some of the Cameron Highlanders. We have several of them. I thought I'd only show you one. Fred's in the center of the second row, and they're all in nice uniforms, and that came as a big surprise to me. But I learned in doing these diaries and preparing for this event that the British sent uniforms to their prisoners through Switzerland, just as the Germans sent uniforms to prisoners held in Canada and Britain through Switzerland. So that's why they're all looking pretty good. When they got off that beach, some of them had very little clothing on, so the question to me was, how did they get the uniforms? And that was the answer to it. Okay. The prisoners had to make most of their own tools and utensils, and this is a drawing that Fred did of some of the things that he made along the way, and it sort of reflects what other people were doing. If they either made it or they traded for it. And what they traded was some of the contents of their Red Cross parcels, which by that time in the war, the German population was going out without a lot of things, so the prisoners could make use of some of the sweaters and foodstuffs and whatever were being sent from home. And this is another drawing that he did from behind his hut. It's the guard tower and the fence. Okay. Now, at the end of January 1945, the guards and the prisoners could hear this constant rumble of Russian artillery fire. And so at roughly the end of January one morning, the guards assembled all of the prisoners outside their huts. It was in a snowstorm, it was cold, and they just started marching them to the west. They wanted to avoid the Russians, and over 4.5 months, they marched approximately 750 kilometers going westwards into Germany to try and avoid capture by the Russians. And the other bad things, it probably wouldn't have been so bad for the Canadian prisoners, but the German guards were certainly terrified of what the Russians would do to them if they caught them. It was very cold. They didn't have proper clothing, and mostly they didn't have food other than what they could scrounge, and so they picked up turnips and beets in fields, and occasionally they would be fed a meal along the way by people the prisoners were put in their barns at night occasionally. And in one community, a young German soldier had recently been repatriated from Canada, and he'd been very well treated here. And he told everyone how well he'd been treated. So when the Canadian prisoners arrived in this little town, that was the one place where they got a good hot meal along the way. Another little story I can share with you is that there were many German civilians trying to get away from the Russians, and the prisoners and the German civilians would share both the hardships and whatever food they could find. Fred had no particular animus against Germans. He thought most of them were okay people. He didn't like the Zealots, and he didn't like the Nazis, and he didn't like mean people. But I thought that was pretty telling about him as a human being, that he could go through all this and come out the other end and recognize people for what they were and how they acted, rather than what the propaganda said about them. Okay. Now, they were liberated by the American 7th Army in late April of 1945, and after a couple of days of enjoying the local scenery and eating good food again, they were loaded on airplanes, flown to England, where they went into a repatriation camp. They had, had their teeth checked and their eyesight, and if they had any other medical problems, any problems whatsoever, they tried to help the prisoners with that. And then they were sent on leave before they were repatriated to Canada. And the prisoners had priority for the shipping coming back to Canada. So in early June, Fred and a load of other POWs got on the SS Pasteur, and the same ship he'd come across in 1940, and went back to Halifax. And there's the ship. Now this is another neat little story. While we were preparing for this presentation, I contacted the Naval Museum in Halifax, and this is the SS Pasteur on the day that Fred arrived. And I can't point him out to you, but he's amongst those at the railing there, and you can probably see the Nazi battle flag, the war trophy. He describes in his diary his intense emotions as they docked in Halifax, and how much he wanted to get back to Kenora. So a quiet man's journey through hell was complete. Thank you very much.
Am I on? Thank you. Thanks, Jim. It was Saturday, June the 30th, 1945, and in Dad's last journal entry, he wrote, "All day from Reveille, there was a feeling of suppressed excitement throughout the ship. Immediately after dinner, men started taking advantage points all over the ship. Our first sight of Canada was the entrance lighthouse to Halifax at 1:20 p.m., a sight I've dreamt about for years. We had a wonderful reception, a band boat with a goodly complement of girls, a fireboat with all the hoses shooting water high in the air, a great cheer when the bow line snubbed, and another one at the stern at 3:10 p.m. Number 6 MD unloading now. Number 10 POW tonight at 21 and 2200 hours. We have arrived. Lance Corporal Frederick Thomas Lodge, a proud member of the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders of Canada, had arrived home. Jim has shared the military and POW stories about Fred Lodge, and I'd like to share a few stories about the man that my sister, my brother, and I knew and loved as our dad and our hero. In reading Dad's diaries and knowing our dad for what he had experienced and endured in life, for me, the best word to describe him is tenacity. The hallmark of an optimist, someone who refuses to give up when faced with adversity. After the war, Dad returned back to Kenora. After a short stay, he traveled back to Toronto to take a course in radio technology and repairs. And as you'll read in his diaries, he had a great love for communication, which was also a very important part for his military duties, whether through being a signaler, doing Morse code, radio transmission, or radio repairs. While in Toronto, he met our mom, who was working at an ammunition plant during the war, and they returned to Kenora and were married in 1946. When Dad came back to Kenora, he couldn't find a job in radio repair technology because other returnees had been working in the same occupation. He was now married and had a new responsibility, so he took on a good-paying job at the local pulp and paper mill, where he remained till his passing in 1976. When Dad was a POW and going through some very tough times, with a lack of food and very unsanitary conditions, he stated in his diaries, "Should I come out of this? Should I get married and have children? I promise my kids will never starve." And we didn't. He made sure we had a very good life. My sister, my brother, and I often talk about the stories about how Dad made our Saturdays very special. Even after a long, hard work day, Dad would come home and make from scratch homemade fries. We ate them as fast as he could make them as we sat and watched our favorite Bugs Bunny and the Roadrunner on our new black and white TV. And not to forget about Dad's lunch bucket, where he stored special treats. Every payday, Dad would go into town, cash his paycheck, head over to Woolworths, and buy his favorite bridge mixture. And we would greet Dad at the door. We would fight over who was going to help him with his lunch bucket when he got home, as he meticulously put it on the fridge so that we couldn't get at it. Our dad loved chocolate, and we learned to love it too. In his diaries, he also spoke about his Christmases as a POW and how the men did their best to have some sort of Christmas spirit by putting up a pine tree and then decorating it with homemade decorations from scrap pieces of material that they would find around the Stalag. And they also painted special Christmas scenes in the huts where they stayed. And to keep himself and his POW buddies entertained, he whittled out of the scrap pieces of wood a set of drumsticks, which he eventually brought home with him. And these drumsticks would reappear periodically, especially around holiday times. Dad would drum out a beat across the furnace in our living room, up the door frames, across the kitchen table, down the chairs. Dad always made our Christmases very special. Although our Christmases were never lavish, we always got our one most wanted gift each year, and lots of good Christmas food. Dad was a great journalist. He had a great command of the English language, extremely detailed. In reading his diaries, you can close your eyes and envision exactly what he's talking about. He uses big words, ones that I would have to stop and look in the dictionary to understand the meaning. I remember as a kid, one particular day, I didn't want to go to school. Dad had just arrived home working the night shift, and I told him I wasn't feeling very well, and I couldn't go to school. He shook his head, okay, like he was in agreement. He said, "I'll just let the school know that you have a bad case of halitosis." I said, oh boy, he must think I'm really sick to have that. I didn't know what it was. So I thought I'd better go to the dictionary and figure out what it was that I really had. I said, "Really, Dad? Bad breath? Oh, come on." Needless to say, I never pulled that trick again. Dad continued his journalistic efforts as he grew older. When I got married and moved to Toronto, Dad would send me bi-weekly 13-page letters detailing his everyday activities. I remember when he got a typewriter to help him with his letter writing because he thought it would make it a little bit easier, but he often blamed his Japanese friend for all the mistakes it made. Dad's detailed war and POW stories were never shared with us when we were growing up as kids. His diaries were locked away in a special cupboard, and we were never allowed to go to it. I'd often wonder why Dad would sit in the kitchen with a cigarette in his hand, stare into space, and not talk for long periods of time. And why, in my eyes, that he spent so much time at the Legion. But you know, back then, nobody ever talked about PTSD. It wasn't until after I had the opportunity to travel to Poland, where I visited the POW site where Dad was incarcerated for 3 years, and then a visit to Vimy Ridge, and after hearing and learning of the horrific stories of war and what our soldiers had to endure, I now understood the importance of the Royal Canadian Legion, where our vets could go, share their stories with like-minded vets who truly understood what they were feeling. When Dad passed away at the young age of 63, he left behind a very memorable legacy. He taught us unconditional love and respect, and to always be the very best at what we chose to be in life. Knowing the life hurdles that Dad had endured, how he fulfilled the remainder of his life, and after reading his diaries and understanding the sacrifices that our dad and others had made for the freedom of our country, the engraving on his headstone, "Life's work well done," is a very fitting tribute to Dad. As a family, we realized that we had a great story to share with others. We sent the transcribed diaries to Fraser Press for their editor's manuscript evaluation to see if the book was just for family and friends or to be shared with others. And I'd like to share with you the evaluator's remarks, and I quote, "As someone who grew up listening in fascination as my grandfather told endless stories about his experiences in World War II, it was a real treat to have this manuscript land on my desk. Not only was it as fascinating and enjoyable read for me, at one point, I realized I had in my hand a unique piece of Canadian history that few people have had the opportunity to experience. In this regard, I am so happy that you are choosing to have Fred's diaries published. I see a huge audience for this manuscript, including those who are currently serving or those who have served in the military, whose relatives, like me, have served in World War II, World War II historians and other academics, particularly those who focus on Dieppe and prisoners of war, and even actors and writers who want an unfiltered view of what life was like for the average soldier, tossed to and from by the often chaotic forces of a broader conflict in which Fred was just one tiny, seemingly insignificant cog. However, Fred's journals reveal he was anything but insignificant, and they go a long way towards humanizing not only him, but his fellow soldiers and POWs, and even those who held him captive during the Dieppe raid." End of quote. Wow, these are such powerful and encouraging words. So on behalf of my sister Carol, my brother Fred, and my cousin Jim and his wife Wendy, I thank you for letting us share our story with you. We hope that you too will enjoy reading Dad's diary as much as we have. And the book is entitled Fred Lodge's Diary, A Quiet Man's Journey Through Hell. Thank you.